Good evening and welcome to the New School. My name is Karen Kooni. I'm the director of the Viralist Center for Art and Politics, and I'm confronting two amazing entities tonight. There's of course Obama, in the title of the lecture, and then there's Simon Critchley. And since the talk is about branding, it seems appropriate that they're both in the room, one physically and the other in words, and that you confirm that they're both related to branding. Each year, many of the programs at the center are dedicated to a theme of particular urgency and broad resonance. Tonight we launched this cycle under the heading of Branding Democracy, and the cycle will continue for an entire year. When regimes throughout the world, regardless of their form of government, evoke democracy, when the foundations of our own democracy are openly or less openly contested, when the most democratic, that is to say, participatory processes seem to happen in cyberspace, we must ask what the concept of democracy means. What does democracy mean in terms of a continuously evolving open project that relies on fixed structures of governance? What does democracy mean when short-term gratification is sought by voters and promised by politicians? Has democracy become a brand? Is it packaged to achieve certain goals of the government and to fulfill certain desires of the citizenry, not unlike a consumer brand? These are some of the questions that we will address in future programs, as well as in an exhibition that is being presented by Parsons, the New School for Design, and will open in just about a month, October 15th. It's a collaboration between Parsons and the Viralist Center for Art and Politics. Barack Obama and the American Void is the title that Simon Critchley has given to this lecture, launching the cycle on branding democracy. Two preeminent figures in our public lives come together, as I mentioned, Obama, of course, and then Simon Critchley, professor of philosophy at the New School for Social Research, who, through his academic and non-academic writings and his public appearances, is very much a presence beyond the New School campus. And I'd like to thank him very much for having accepted the invitation to speak tonight. For a more detailed biography, please consult your programs. Let me just briefly mention that from his first book on The Ethics of Deconstruction, published in 1992, Critchley has argued for an ethical dimension to the study of philosophy, especially deconstructivism. And with the publication of Ethics, Politics, Subjectivity in 1999, he added a political orientation. Throughout his work, intellectual independence, even defiance and irreverence shapes Simon Critchley's writing. Its style is not necessarily compliant with philosophical canons or conventions, and its subject matter is often unexpected. Few other philosophers would deign to seriously consider humor, as he did On Humor, published in 2002, or to write about very little, almost nothing, the title of another book. In short, his is a roving and comprehensive intellect, embracing quotidian as well as metaphysical concerns, which brings us to the subject at hand, Barack Obama, who, as Professor Critchley has mentioned in the past, is the epitome of the American brand of democracy. Before I hand this podium over on this opening event of our year-long cycle, I'd like to acknowledge the support of Linda Dunn, the Dean of the New School for General Studies, and the members of the Viralist Center's Advisory Committee, which is chaired by James Keith Brown. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Pam Tillis, Director of Public Programs, and I'd like to acknowledge the support of Jakob Schillinger and Bartholomew Ryan at the Viralist Center, who helped conceive this program and others in the past few months. Parsons, the New School for Design, is a collaborator in the upcoming exhibitions, and it's my pleasure to thank Tim Marshall, the Dean of Parsons, and Lydia Matthews, Dean of Educational Programs. And I'd also like to acknowledge, in closing, the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, which has supported this program and all others in this series. Please join me now in welcoming Simon Critchley.
Thank you, Karen, for the invitation to give this inaugural lecture on at the Virilis Centre for Art and Politics. It's a great honour and a pleasure to be with you this evening. Secondly, let me apologise for changing my topic. I changed my topic about a month ago. The original topic was going to be on Democracy is a Fiction. That was going to be the title. And I just want to tell you something about that, and then because it's linked to what I'm going to talk about in the when I get to Obama. And there's a quotation from David Hume, Le Bon David, where he says, nothing is more surprising to those who consider human affairs with a philosophic eye than to see the easiness with which the many are governed by the few, and to observe the implicit submission with which men resign their own sentiments and passions to those of their rulers. When we inquire by what means this wonder is brought about, we shall find that as force is always on the side of the governed, the governors have nothing to support them but opinion. 'Tis therefore an opinion only that government is founded, and this maxim extends to the most despotic and the most military governments, as well as the most free and the most popular. The question I was going to begin with is the question of the enigma of politics. How is it that the many are governed by the few? And the answer that Hume gives, given that force is always on the side of the governed, is through opinion. And that means that the activity of government is the activity of the managing of opinions, and the managing of opinions through fiction. So the category that I wanted to talk about was the way in which fiction functions as a political category. Government requires make-believe, whether a despotic regime, a military regime, or the most free and popular of regimes. And the nature of those fictions is fascinating. I was going to talk about the fiction of popular sovereignty. Government by the people, for the people. And the history of that fiction, and how that fiction replaced another fiction, which is the fiction of the divine right of kings. The interesting thing about those two fictions is that we consider one more or less unquestionable and one more or less unbelievable. The idea that there is a king or a queen who is the embodiment of God, and the legitimacy of government resides in that authority, strikes us as absurd. The fiction that replaces that is the fiction of popular sovereignty, where in a sense, the voice of God becomes the voice of the people. That happens in the 17th century in the English Revolution, so-called Civil War, goes underground for a little while in the fudgy compromise of the so-called Glorious Revolution, reappears in the 1750s, 60s in debates in the US. So it's the fiction of popular sovereignty, and in particular, how that fiction was employed in the shaping of political institutions in the United States by Madison, under the direct influence of Hume. Hume's idea of a perfect commonwealth, where he recommends, for example, one idea that was adopted, that the number of senators should be 100. No more, no less. I was going to talk about the ultimately theological function of such fictions, where the voice of God becomes the voice of the people, and try and show how this might allow us to think about the critical and political function of contemporary art. And to this extent, and I think of Karin's, the wonderful exhibition that she's curated and which will open on October the 16th, is that right? October the 16th. Ours, Democracy in the Age of Branding. A lot of the work in this exhibition is concerned with the question broadly of fiction. I was going to try and think about some of the artworks in that exhibition as examples of political art, where art points out and criticizes the political fictions that we live by. The national fictions, the symbolic fictions, the ritualized fictions. Some of the work that caught my eye, to name some artists, was the work of Yael Bartana, the Yes Men, Ariel Roshko, Johan Tiren, and Brian Tollem. All of which, in different ways, critically redescribe the pathologies and rituals of democracy in our age, the age of branding. I also want to think about other traditions of democracy, traditions which also have deep roots in the United States. Traditions of direct democracy, of local forms of assembly, of local forms of autonomy, where people gather, often here linked to forms of religious assembly. Hail the Shakers. I love the Shakers. Of course, there should be a female complement to Christ. Her name is Anne Lee, and she's from Manchester. You know. And I was going to think about that in relationship to this work by Liam Gillick, which will be at the center of, it's a site-specific installation at the center of Karen's show, which I want to give an Icelandic interpretation of, which I won't go into now. But if you know about the way in which, during the period of the Icelandic Commonwealth, the law was given, there was circular declarations of the law. There's a way in which this seems to, the structure of it appeals to traditions of gathering and direct democracy. So I would have liked to talk about the political function of contemporary art. It's not just to criticize the political fictions to which we are subject, but to propose other fictions. If you like, fictions of association, or associational fictions. For me, the key word in politics is association. That is, if you like, the be-all and end-all of the nature of politics, the being of politics, if you want to get philosophical. And the question for me, I mean, by fiction, I don't mean anything negative. Fiction for me is a positive term, right? It is the case that government requires make-believe. The way in which the many govern the few is through fictions. It's not a question of opposing fictions with fact, but of articulating new forms of fiction. And the thought that I'm trying to transpose from the poetic to the political domain is the question of the supreme fiction, which is a term that you find in Wallace Stevens. He borrows it from his teacher, Santayana. And a supreme fiction is a fiction which we know to be a fiction, but in which we nevertheless believe. And for me, that's the issue. Can there be a fiction that we know to be a fiction, but in which we nevertheless believe? This is the trick. I would have ended by talking about other ideas of democracy closer to my own heart than the BlackBerry-driven media spectacle of American presidential politics, namely anarchist traditions of local and direct governments of genuine, traditions of genuine popular autonomy without the institutions of state, law, and bureaucracy. And who knows, it might have made a nice lecture, and one day I might end up giving it. But as August dragged along, and something began to bug me and obsess me, and about the upcoming presidential elections, and in particular about the person of Obama, the ultimate brand. You know, look at the T-shirts on Union Square. I became obsessed with following his speeches, and reread The Audacity of Hope closely, obsessively, read for the first time Dreams from My Father, and just began to try and turn this over in my mind because something was puzzling me. Something was sort of snagging, and I wanted to work out what that was in the way in which one normally does it through writing. Before I get into Obama, let me make myself clear. I think the Republican Party are a bunch of crooks and liars who have done their best to ruin the economy, legal and political institutions and good name of this country. If McCain and Palin, Palin, the palindrome, the person who says the same thing backwards as forwards. Palin, Palin palingenesis, which is Ernst Haeckel's term for a form of birth where the ancestral features are exactly reproduced without modification. In other words, more of the same. Why don't democratic strategists consult the Oxford English Dictionary? Or Palin, the palinode. Palin, palinode, where a palinode is something where a person retracts something said earlier. The bridge to nowhere policy. So palindrome, palingenesis, palinode, the 3 Ps. Anyway, if, I digress. If McCain and Palin win on November the 4th, I don't need to tell you it will be a disaster that's not just political or economic, but also spiritual. I hope to God it doesn't happen, and I'm very glad I'm not American if it does. You know, I don't think it will happen. I think that Obama will win. I've got no real basis for that belief, but I think that will happen. What I say about Obama now comes out of a sense of complete enchantment with him, having been captivated by his rhetoric, his political genius, but also by a sense of bewilderment. And that's what I want to try and put my finger on. And sadly, I don't think I'm the only person to experience this. But let me try and explain what I mean. There is something desperately lonely about Barack Obama's universe. One gets the overwhelming sense of someone yearning for connection, for something that binds human beings together, for community and commonality, for what he repeatedly calls, in The Audacity of Hope, the common good. Of course, this is hardly news. We've known since the 2004 keynote speech at the Democratic National Convention that there is not a black America and a white America, and Latino America and Asian America. There's the United States of America. Obama's remedy to the widespread disillusion with politics in the US is a reaffirmation of the Act of Union. The Act of Union performatively expressed in the first words of the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Right? This, for Obama, this perfection of the Act of Union is only possible insofar as we restore a sense of community to the nation. If you read his work, the word that keeps coming through is the idea of community, of which he was an organizer, obviously, and the idea of community as communion. Really? That's the thought. This, in turn, requires a belief in the common good. So in the face of the grotesque inequality, governmental sleaze, and generalized anomie of the world, we need to, Obama says, affirm our bonds with each other. Right? Affirm our bonds with each other. And this belief in the common good is the sole basis for hope. And without such belief, there is nothing to be done. So the first move I want to make is to say, well, the core of Obama's strategy is to declare a notion of the common good, to aspire for a more perfect union, which requires an act of belief. And that belief is the basis for hope. This is the avowedly improbable, the word he always uses, right? The avowedly improbable basis for Obama's entire push for the presidency. It's a Rousseauian strategy, which is good. I mean, I like Rousseau a lot. What I mean by that is that there's a letter that Rousseau writes to Voltaire in 1756, where he says, in Rousseau's typically paranoid and arrogant manner, I would like you, as the last and greatest work of your career, to write a civil profession of faith, a catechism of the citizen. A catechism of the citizen. At the core of Obama's strategy is an attempt to produce, if you like, a catechism of the citizen, to infuse liberalism with belief. And that's what that's what interests me. It's an ideological politics in that sense, right? Now, the obvious criticism that one could make, conditional tense, one could make at this point, is that Obama's politics is governed by an anti-political fantasy. What lies behind the appeal to the common good? That, he says, no one is exempt from the call to find common ground, or not so far beneath the surface, I think we're becoming more, not less alike. 2 quotes from The Audacity of Hope. This, one might claim, is the familiar delusion of an end to politics. The postulation of a state where we can put aside our differences, overcome partisanship, and come together in order to heal the union. This is the way the rhetoric call it, overcoming partisanship in order to heal the union, more perfect union. The same longing for unity governs Obama's discourse on race, with his call for a black-brown alliance and his appeasing remark where he says, rightly or wrongly, white guilt has largely exhausted itself. And again, one thing that's on my mind is the differences of register between the first and second books by Obama, in Dreams from My Father and Audacity of Hope. Because in Dreams from My Father, there is a much more, a different discourse on race. And maybe I'll say some words on that as we go along. But Obama's dream, which is a dream of the common good, sustained by belief, the audacity of hope, is a dream of a society without power relations. Without the agonism that constitutes political life. Against such a position, one might claim that justice is always an agon. It's always a conflict. And to refuse this is to consign human beings to wallowing in some emotional, fusional balm. Right? This, we could say, is the lesson of politics from Aeschylus onwards. Politics, justice is conflict, and it requires an act of decision, an act of power, an act of force, even an act of deception. Say in the case of Athena, saying to the Furies, well, I may look like a woman, you may think I have your interests at heart, but actually I was born fully formed from the head of my father. I honor the male principle in all things, you're screwed. That's justice, Athenian style, right? That's the... One might add that the source of this longing for union is its absence. We desperately want to believe because we don't and we can't. The yearning for the common good, the yearning for perfect union, comes from a refusal to accept that perhaps Americans have very little in common, apart from the elements of a sometimes highly successful civil religion based around a sentimental, indeed sometimes teary-eyed, attachment to the Constitution and a belief in the quasi-divine wisdom of the Founding Fathers, all of which Obama subscribes to if you read the chapter on the Constitution in The Audacity of Hope. You know, so if you like, if you want an example of what Habermas would call constitutional patriotism, then if you read the chapter on the Audacity of Hope on the Constitution, you get that. This is he fully signs up to that vision. Now, in the face of George W. Bush's ultra-political stance of the massive extension of executive power and the prosecution of a politics of fear based on the identification of an enemy as morally evil, it's not difficult to understand the popular appeal of Obama's anti-political vision. I mean, a category we could introduce here, I was just thinking about this literally a few minutes before coming in, was whether you could make a distinction between Obama's anti-political politics based on an act of union and Bush's millenarian politics. By millenarian politics, I mean politics where salvation is terrestrial, it's linked to a Messiah figure, and most importantly, it requires the identification of someone morally evil, right? The Antichrist in classical forms of millenarianism. So, in a sense, we have a contrast between from millenarian politics, axis of evil, these people are the embodiments of the Antichrist, and the religious conflict will take place on that level, and an anti-political politics of Obama. Against the messianic certainties of Bush, Obama promises a return to a beatific liberalism, where everything is seen sub specie consensus. This is a world where good old democratic deliberation replaces decisionism, where the to and fro of civil conversation replaces religious absolutism, and where John Rawls usurps Leo Strauss. Democracy, Obama says, is not a house to be built, but a conversation to be had. A conversation to be had. After 8 years of gross mismanagement, secrecy, and lies, it sounds like an absolutely blissful prospect. Right? Now, of course, particularly after the events of this week, one might wonder how Obama's evacuation of power relations in the political realm goes together with his faith in another agon, which is a faith in the agon of capitalism, a faith in the agon of economic competition and the salutary effects of free markets. There's a very interesting remark at the end of The Audacity of Hope, where Obama writes, "The system of free markets and liberal democracy that now characterizes most of the developed world may be flawed. It may all too often reflect the interest of the powerful over the powerless, but that system is constantly subject to change and improvement. And it's precisely this openness to change that market-based liberal democracies offer people around the world as their best chance at a better life." Right? Page 316. So there's a question of how does the longing for a more perfect union at the ethical, ideological level coincide with or harmonize with the agon of competition at the economic level? One might also wonder how such a political position might genuinely begin to deal with the issue of poverty. I don't really see it. But here's a quotation, a footnote from The Social Contract by Rousseau, which is just something that leapt out at me. "Do you want coherence in the state? Then bring the two extremes as close together as possible. Have neither very rich men nor beggars, for these two estates, naturally inseparable, are equally fatal to the common good. From the one class come friends of tyranny, from the other, tyrants. It is always these two classes which make commerce of the public freedom. The one buys, the other sells." Without a clear attempt to take on the issue of poverty in a society which glorifies inequality, in terms of a distinction between rich men and beggars, there will never be coherence. And therefore, and talk of the common good is so much balm. But I don't want to say that. I don't want to go down the route of the classical critique of liberalism, where politics is evacuated in favor of a bifurcation of ethics on the one side and economics on the other, and where ethics is the veil of hypocrisy used to conceal the violence of the economic realm. So it's a tried and tested and very old story that the way liberalism functions is through the evacuation of the political sphere and the construction of an ethical and an economic sphere, where one is the veil of the ideological veil which conceals the violence of the other. I don't even want to propose a critique of Obama. That's not finally what's interesting. I want to try and do something a little bit different. I want to try and describe a puzzlement that I have, which I don't think I'm the only one to experience. What fascinates me is what we might call Obama's subjectivity, and how it forms his political vision, and how this might begin to explain his extraordinary popular appeal, and maybe the limits of that popular appeal. The focus on subjectivity is justified. I mean, this, after all, is a presidential campaign based on autobiography, based on memoir, based on confession, based on sincerity, based on a word that he uses more than once, authenticity, based on authenticity. There's a huge issue in the history of autobiography about the relationship between autobiography and truth, autobiography and authenticity. And having mentioned Rousseau once or twice, maybe you'll understand what I mean. He writes 3 autobiographies, the second of which he tries to deposit on the altar at Notre Dame and gives away in the streets of Paris. Obama's written 2. There is a part of me that would, David Hume wrote a 10-page text called something like My Life or Reflections on My Life, where he begins by saying it is not good for a man to speak too long of himself. And anyway, but there is that. There is the way in which a certain story, a certain construction, a certain autobiography has become the basis for a political campaign. But here's the puzzle. After watching countless speeches and carefully reading his words, I still have absolutely no sense of who Barack Obama is. It's very odd. It's very odd. The more that one reads and listens, the greater the sense of opacity. Opacity is the word that I want to emphasize. There's something opaque here. Take the audacity of hope. There is an easy, informal, and relaxed style to the prose. He talks about going to the gym, ordering a cheeseburger, planning his daughter's birthday party, and all the rest. He mixes position statements and general policy outlines with autobiographical narrative in an extremely compelling and fluent way. I mean, the man can write. Yet I found myself repeatedly asking, who is this man? I don't mean anything sinister by this. It's just that I was overwhelmed by a sense of distance in reading Obama. And the more sincere and more authentic the prose, the greater the sense of distance I felt. He confesses early on in The Audacity of Hope that he's not someone that easily gets worked up about things. He says, ask Michelle, I never get worked up about things. In many ways, that's one way of articulating a problem. Anger is the emotion that produces motion. It's the mood that moves the subject to act. Perhaps it's the first political emotion. There's no politics without anger. I was just eating a bowl of chili in the diner around the corner, so I've got bits of my teeth on. Sorry. If you read Dreams from My Father, the striking thing about that text is the difference of tone around this question of anger. Dreams from My Father is a sharper, more committed, less compromised text. And there's a very different anger on the question of race, particularly the description of what goes on in Kenya when he visits Kenya and the rest. In a sense, it's a more political book by being more autobiographical. And because there's more in play, I think there's less at stake. It has a different feel. And there's also something, if you read it, just genuinely moving about the story of Barak Senior, about the Barak's unconsciously being aware of crying in Trinity Church after a sermon, and him weeping over his father's and grandfather's graves in Kenya. So, I mean, there are two books, Dreams from My Father and Audacity of Hope. If one is articulated in relation to the father, the other is articulated in relation to the mother, and I'll come back to that in a second. But there is an anger in that first book which is absent from the second. At the core of the Audacity of Hope is someone who lives at a distance, someone distant from himself and from others, and desperately craving a bond, a commitment that binds him together with other Americans and binds Americans together, a more perfect union. There is a true horror vacui in Obama, a terror of loneliness, a terror of nothingness. He yearns for an unconditional commitment that will shape his subjectivity and fill the vacuum, fill the American void. He desires contact with some plenitude, some experience of fullness that might still his sense of loneliness, fill his isolation, silence his endless doubt, and assuage his feelings of abandonment. And this is what he seems to find in Christianity. So I want to turn to it in a second. There's an interesting topic here, which is the topic of loneliness as a political factor, which we can perhaps think about. There's a new book by Tom Dunn on this thing called Loneliness as a Way of Life, where Tom Dunn argues that loneliness is something perennial in American life, a sense of anomie that haunts the long song of myself that is American democracy. So there's this issue of loneliness, I think, is a deep existential issue, which is extremely interesting. But let me get back to this question of opacity. Obama is opaque. But perhaps this opacity is Obama's political genius. It's precisely the enigmatic, slightly inert, listless character of Obama that seems to generate the desire to identify with him, indeed to love him. Perhaps it is that sense of internal distance, that sense of loneliness and abandonment that people see in him and see in themselves. Obama recognizes this capacity in an intriguing and profound remark at the beginning of The Audacity of Hope, when he writes, "I serve as a blank screen on which people of vastly different political stripes project their own views." I serve as a blank screen, or a Rorschach, he's described himself as. A blank screen on which people of vastly different political stripes project their own views. Like a good psychoanalyst, Obama is a mirror that reflects back whatever the viewer wants to see. As he says repeatedly, as he said in the Mile High Stadium speech, it's not about me, it's about you. Right? There's something profoundly true about that. Something is going on at the level of identification with some sense of distance and opacity, which is about us, not about him, which is why he's capable of being loaded with so many different political significations. This is truly interesting, I think. But somehow, our loneliness, our doubt, and our abandonment become focused and fused with his. Obama's desire for unity, for union with a common good, becomes unified with ours. And for that moment, and maybe only for that moment, we believe, we hope. It's a strangely restrained ecstasy, a liberal ecstasy, a rational ecstasy, not the zealot's ecstasy of Palin, but an ecstasy nonetheless. So there's something I'm saying about this opacity, this sense of detachment that allows an identification which somehow articulates our detachment and loneliness and affords an experience of quiet ecstasy, belief, hope. Now this is important, I think crucially important. I mean, there is no politics without belief, in my view, without hope. The liberals have convinced themselves that belief is something that they do. Right? Belief is something that they do. Belief is something that they have. What do we have? We have knowing distance. We have the comfort of the Daily Show. Liberals are, as Richard Rorty said repeatedly, ironists. This is a huge mistake. We need to believe. Obama produces the opaque object of desire in which we can believe. In Mile High Stadium a few weeks ago, you could almost feel the sound of liberals desperate to believe, desperate to overcome irony. And that's the problem. Belief is something they have. Right? We have irony and satire because we're so clever. Right? And that's what's politically fatal. Right? And Obama's strategy is to address that rightly, I think through, if you like, a civil profession of faith. The lyricism of Obama's prose is sometimes possessed of enormous beauty. His doubts about being a father and a husband in the final chapter of The Audacity of Hope are touching and honest. And he finishes the book, like a young Rousseau, by saying that my heart is filled with love for this country. And when he says that, I don't for a minute hear any cynicism. Yet Obama writes and speaks with an anthropologist's eye, with a sense that he is not a participant in the world with which he so desperately wants to commune. Right? Experience is always had and held at a distance. That's the thought I want to sort of just talk about for the remainder of these remarks. I don't want to demean our anthropological colleagues. I mean, I don't know what I'm saying. Anthropologist's eye, a sense that he's not a participant in the world with which he so desperately wants to commune. The passage in The Audacity of Hope that both focuses this sense of distance and complicates it is the passage I want to address is the passage on the death of his mother. His mother died of cancer at the age of 52 when Obama was, I think, 32. And he writes, and there's this book, he can write, right? I mean, it's powerful, but there's something, again, as I was just saying, something opaque and detached about the prose for long periods. But there's this flare of direct intensity. He says, more than once, about his mother, more than once I saw fear flash across her eyes. More than fear of pain or fear of the unknown, it was the sheer loneliness of death that frightened her, I think. The notion that on this final journey, on this last adventure, she would have no one to fully share her experiences with, no one who could marvel with her at her body's capacity to inflict pain on itself, or laugh at the stark absurdity of life once one's hair starts falling out and one's salivary glands shut down. It's an amazing passage, extraordinary passage. Marvel with her at her body's capacity to inflict pain on itself. when one's hair starts falling out and one's salivary glands shut down. His mother was an anthropologist. Right? She died as an anthropologist. She died with a feeling of distance from others and an inability to commune with them and to communicate her pain. Perhaps this is the root of Obama's horror vacui, his horror of the void, his sense of loneliness and abandonment. I mean, maybe, I was just again making notes on this before eating my chili earlier on. I mean, you could maybe divide up, I mean, there are two books, right? One's on the father, one's on the mother. The father is all about dream, maybe, if you like, pleasure principle in some sense. It's about the fantasy of a father image, and the closure of the book, the closed circle he talks about at the end of the book, is when he realizes that the imago of his father that he constructed is a fiction, and he gets over it and becomes who he is. So if you like, there's the father side, if you like, the pleasure principle which achieves some sort of closed circle. On the mother's side, there's something like reality principle, distance and loneliness. And these two things seem to play out against each other in a very, very interesting way. But in order to understand this issue of his sense of loneliness and his connection, so let me just stop blathering. The death of his mother is an experience of her loneliness, right? That's the horror of the void. But in order to understand his response to this, we have to turn to the question of religion. Why do we need religion? Obama recognizes that people turn to religion because they want, quote, a narrative arc to their lives. A narrative arc to their lives. Something that will relieve a chronic loneliness or lift them above the exhausting, relentless toil of daily life. The alternative is clear. It's nihilism. A word he uses, I'm sure, won't go down well in Alaska, clinging to guns and religion and the rest. He's going to regret those words, isn't he? He's going to regret those. The alternative is nihilism. Nihilism means traveling down a long highway towards nothingness. It's a quotation from it, Audacity of Hope. What is religion then? Religion is this narrative arc, and it satisfies a need for fullness, a transcendence that fills the void. I mean, one could talk about that in relationship to Charles Taylor's overly long, overrated book on a secular age. But Taylor identifies, as it were, two criteria for religion, fullness and transcendence. Right? So what religion is about is an experience of fullness and an experience of transcendence. And for Obama, that seems to work rather well. What he needs is a fullness of experience as a way of filling the void. And this is where we have to return to Obama's mother. Obama's path to Christianity plays out against the background of his anthropologist mother's respectful distance from religion. Like many of us, Obama initially looks to what he calls, quote, political philosophy for help. Right? Political philosophy. I don't know exactly who he means, but we've all been there, right? You look for political philosophy for help. And what he means by that, he wants confirmation of the values that he inherited from his mother. Those values are, to list them, honesty, empathy, discipline, very important, discipline, obsessional maybe, delayed gratification and hard work. Those are the core values. honesty, empathy, discipline, delayed gratification, and hard work, and a way in which they might be transformed into systems of action, which he says, that can help build community and make justice real. There's the program. Right? Virtue, in other words. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, also like many of us, he doesn't find the answer in political philosophy. He only finds an answer by confronting a dilemma that his mother never resolved. And he writes this second quotation I want to give from the book. It's a fascinating passage. He says, "The Christians with whom I worked in Chicago's South Side, the Christians with whom I worked recognized themselves in me. They saw that I knew their book and shared their values and sang their songs. But they sensed that part of me remained removed, detached, an observer among them." Right? Detached, an observer among them. "I came to realize that without a vessel for my beliefs, without an unequivocal commitment to a particular community, I would be consigned at some level to remain apart. Free in the way that my mother was free. Right? Free in the way my mother was free, but also alone in the same way that she was ultimately alone." It's an interesting passage. So what is freedom? Freedom for Obama is the negative freedom from commitment that has left his mother feeling detached and alone. It culminates in the solitude of her experience of her experience of death, or her experience of dying. Such is the freedom of the void, right? So this is freedom as the freedom of the void. Being anthropologically respectful of all faiths, as her mother was, the Upanishads or whatever it might be, means being committed to none and being left adrift without an anchor for one's most deeply held beliefs. To have such an anchor, Obama makes clear, means being committed to a specific community. Right? This is like the Hegelian moment this is the moment of Sittlichkeit. The only way in which Obama can overcome his sense of detachment and resolve his mother's dilemma is through a commitment to Christianity. But what does that mean? That's, again, it's a very interesting question. It's not, as it were, he reads Charles Taylor and thinks, okay, I'll become a Christian or something. It's not that. It's a commitment to the historically black church. It's there that he can find a sense of grounding and fullness, he says. This culminates in his baptism in Trinity United Church in Chicago's South Side. He wasn't baptized by Pastor Jeremiah Wright, but he was married by them, and both his children were baptized by Pastor Wright. Whatever one makes of it, the absolute centrality of black Christianity in the arc of Obama's narrative is what makes his fractious relationship with Pastor Wright so important and so intriguing. At a personal level, sure, but at a conceptual level, even more so. Everything turns here on the relationship between the prophetic and the governmental, I think. The prophetic word is God damns America. Right? That's the prophetic word. God damns America when it does this. The governmental word, the word of civil religion, is my heart is filled with love for this country. Right? Matters are far from simple. I think Wright is right. He has a point. But what we see here is I think a deep issue about, if you like, two orders of religion. Wright's point is that there is a separation between the prophetic and the governmental. Right? A separation between the city of God and the city of man. Obama's strategy, which is a strategy which is intended to remotivate liberalism with belief, with a civil profession of faith, with a catechism, is to collapse those two orders, right? Or to identify those two orders. to infuse the governmental with something of the prophetic. And this obviously opens up a huge question in the history of the relationship between politics and theology on this issue. Must there be a separation between the city of God and the city of man? This is the tradition that begins with Augustine and ends with Ratzinger, right? What is certain about Obama's commitment to Christianity is that it is a choice. It's the word that he uses. It's a choice. It's a clear-minded, rational choice. It's not a conversion experience based on any personal revelation. There's an extremely bad book that I read last week. Any friends of Stephen Mansfield? Yeah. Probably I shouldn't have said that. But any friends? It's great. Love it. Great cover. No, it really is. It's it's anyway. No, I've lost my train of thought. He says, quote, "Religious commitment did not require me to suspend critical thinking. It came about as a choice and not an epiphany. The questions that I had did not magically disappear." And although he goes on to add, quote, "I felt God's Spirit beckoning me," close quote, "it's the coolest, most detached experience of religious commitment that one can imagine, without any trace of epiphanic transport and rapture." So the experience of conversion, there's no experience of conversion, that there's a choice for a certain community which is able to fill that void and deal with that loneliness. But one cannot help but feel that Obama's faith craves an experience of communion that is contradicted by the detachment and distance he is seeking to overcome. Let me try and say that again maybe. That Obama's faith craves an experience of union that is contradicted by the detachment and distance he is seeking to overcome. For example, when he's unsure what to tell his daughter about the question of death, he says, quote, "I wondered whether I should have told her the truth, that I wasn't sure what happens when we die, any more than I was sure where the soul resides or what existed before the Big Bang." Now, such skepticism about matters metaphysical is understandable enough and has a fine philosophical ancestry. I began by reading something from Hume. Right? But where does this leave the question of belief, the cornerstone to Obama's entire presidential campaign? And we come back to where we started with the idea of the common good. Obama desperately wants to believe in the common good as a way of providing a fullness to experience that avoids the slide into nihilism. That's the way the thing shapes up, I think. But sometimes I don't know if he knows what belief is and what it would be to hold such a belief. It all seems so distant and opaque. The persistent presence of the mother's dilemma, the sense of loneliness, doubt, detachment, and abandonment, the reality principle, if you like, seems palpable and ineliminable. We must believe, but we can't believe. And perhaps this is the tragedy that some of us see in Obama and in ourselves, a change we can believe in and the crushing realization that nothing will change. Thank you very much for listening. How do you want to do this, Karen? Do you want to?
We have a floating mic, and you indicated if you have questions.
Sure.
So if you have questions or comments, please raise your hand.
So, gentleman at the front here.
I don't know if everyone can hear me, but
There's a mic coming. Just.
is it on? Yeah, okay. One word you didn't mention was charisma. Now, maybe that's a word you don't like. I could understand why, because it's like too easy.
Yeah.
On the other hand, let's face it, political leaders rise or fall on their charisma or lack of it.
Yeah.
I think in the United States, most Americans don't trust charisma. There's something suspicious about it.
Yeah.
We might, in Obama's case, say that his opaqueness, this is more of a question to you, and it sounds like
Yeah.
a statement, but it's really more of a question. This opaqueness seems to me part and parcel of the fact of any charisma.
Right.
If you're too transparent, then you don't have charisma. You have to project something that we don't understand. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I'm suspicious of charisma in politics. There's an issue for me about the relationship between charisma and libido, which I can't really put into words. But if you listen to Bill Clinton and you listen to Obama, you're listening. Or there's a great, I think was it Joe Klein said of Joe Klein said, you know, what if you took the libido out of Clinton, what would you have? And he said, Tony Blair. And it is a deep remark, I think. And there's an issue here which I've been talking about with my wife over the summer, because we've been watching this stuff and trying to figure it out, about the libidinousness of Republicans. And this just interests me. I don't really have a view on this. It's something that, you know, there's something, but if you watch that Palin speech, there's something libidinous going on there, which isn't going on in the Obama speech. It's, you know, it's as certain commentators pointed out, there's a Thatcherized dimension to that. So yes, there's libido. Yes, there's charisma, sure. And you know, I've been captivated by him, you know, completely in hearing him speak, and I hope that comes across. I'm not trying to rubbish him at all. I'm just perplexed. There's something which snags, you know, and I'm trying to put my finger on. But maybe you're right. Please, gentlemen there.
Why did you determine to focus on what kind of a person Obama is instead of what his policies are?
Oh, right. Because the presidential campaign, and I don't know whether there is a precedent for this, but I'm not aware of one. I'm not a student of American politics. Is based upon a person who has constructed himself around a series of memoirs, which are not, you know, which are elaborately written. You know, we write books. We know how long it takes to craft. They're not short books either. They're beautifully, the cadences, the lyricism. It's very, very powerful. I mean, people in the audience would know more than me, but this seems to be a presidential campaign based upon an autobiographical stance. So in a sense, questions about his person are ones that he has, you know, he's made as with the basis for his campaign, his improbable story, right? His improbable story as a basis for reclaiming the American dream in the subtitle to The Audacity of Hope. Sure, there's a chapter on the economy and chapter on foreign policy in Audacity of Hope, which I didn't touch on. And there's a whole slew of economic policies which is producing, fiscal and the rest, which need to be attended to. But I'm looking at, I'm responding to something that's been, you know, I think presented, you know, it's not just, yeah. I hope things focus more on his policy than his person. Who was next? Hey, who's got the mic? Well, the questions are over here. We should get some questions over there. Okay, there's some over.
Hi.
Hello.
So thanks for talking. It was very interesting. I think that you focused almost entirely on the notion of belief, which I think is right.
Yeah.
And only mentioned change kind of at the end. which I also think is right. It's sort of a very empty word,
yeah.
but I think intentionally. And I wonder what you think. That I'm tempted to think, in looking at what Obama's doing, that it's intended almost as a campaign in order to motivate belief, not to depend upon belief, in a sense that to see him win would be to almost believe in the possibility of a real political discourse in this country again. Not that he's going to be a perfect president,
Sure.
but that it would symbolically sort of change the coordinates of our
Absolutely,
political
and
discourse.
I really, 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 really hope that happens. Because just think about November the 5th, if that doesn't happen, and then think about the consequences of that if it doesn't happen. It is really nightmarish, and but yes, and of course everything. His position is compromised. It's sanitized and all the rest. The change issue I didn't talk about. I mean, something I was going to mention, but I didn't because I don't know why. But the was a phenomenon of the last month. Quentin Skinner, Quentin Skinner has this interesting argument around this obscure term, I think it's in quintillion, called paradiastole. Paradiastole, he translates as redescription. And for him, as a scholar of Hobbes, there's a problem of redescription in politics. For Hobbes, the political crisis is a crisis of redescription. What that means is that we live in a time, the 17th century in England, the time of the English Revolution, where there is an ambiguity of moral discourse. And the ambiguity of moral discourse is such that thing A begins to mean thing B, and the same word used by X is used by Y, and things shift around. So for Hobbes, the terror of democracy is a terror of ambiguity of meaning. Somehow, with democratic revolution, or with revolution, there is meaning becomes ambiguous, destabilized. Everything is capable of being redescribed in some other way. And for Hobbes, that requires the determination of meaning by the authority of the monarch. Right? That's the argument of Leviathan. But what that puts me in mind of is the fact that if you look at the campaign in the last month, it's the way in which that redescription is constantly happening. We have the vocabulary of change used by Obama, then change taken up by McCain, and then it goes back, and then it goes forth. It's sort of spinning. The other one I've noticed is with partisanship, right? I mean, the whole premise of The Audacity of Hope is a critique of partisanship, right? Washington's become partisan, this is bad, we need to reaffirm the Act of Union, right? That's Obama's line. It's exactly the line that McCain has taken. So it's this, extraordinary sort of semantic flip-flopping around questions of the meaning of political terms, which I find fascinating. How do you arrest that? Well, there's no instance you can appeal to it. You leave it to the media, right? And the whole thing just spins in an increasingly bizarre way. But I'm not sure what things mean anymore, right? I think a lot of us feel that. There's a sort of a dizzying meaninglessness, because words that we thought we knew the meaning of 6 months ago have become something else, and this thing just seems to spin in a BlackBerry-driven, ever tighter circle of craziness, which I think hurts Obama more than it hurts McCain. The issue is that, I mean, how many lies can you tell? Is there any reference to fact in this? Is there such a thing? Right? It seems to be. Yeah, go on. You speak.
Oh, do you want me to speak?
No, only if you want to.
No, I mean, I will comment on one thing, is that what I find fascinating is the way that not only will, say, McCain or Republicans perhaps generally appropriate Obama's position, but then have absolutely no qualms about not following through on that later. I mean, if you listen to Bush's State of the Union addresses, they all sound wonderful.
Yeah. Who's next? Maybe somebody over here. There's a lady there as well.
I'm curious about this exercise you're doing and just zooming out and thinking, what is the task of thinking at this moment? Do you think you needed to do that, and why? Is it so important, or is the question elsewhere? I'm curious.
I don't think it's important. It's
Like, did you what? I
Yeah.
don't know.
Go on.
Maybe I have a feeling that there is some kind of labyrinth that you went through with the Obama loneliness and existentialism and all that I say, well, why is that interesting to me, even though I followed you? Mm-hmm. And then at the end, okay, change is not possible. But didn't we know that before? And what is this all concealing, basically? Even though, I mean, I may understand maybe your target is like, well, is it McCain, Obama, is Obama? But no matter who comes out, there's a kind of paradigm shift at this moment with this kind of, I don't know, maybe it's almost the end of neoliberalism, that it can't function further even. Whoever comes in office, there's a kind of change that's happening. And the question is, for thinkers or artists, what can we think, or where should we focus on, Yeah. Because the initial title of your talk, Democracy, is something...
Fiction.
Is fiction, yeah. It's interesting, but maybe further. I was interested to hear further, more maybe.
Well,
after that, and really, what is the task of thinking now?
Well,
Where?
The task of thinking now is, thinking through the situation in which we find ourselves. That's the task of thinking now. This is an element in which this is an element of that. I was provoked to do it because of an increasing sense of bewilderment and puzzlement. That's it. It's a sense in which, I didn't really, there was something that was snagging at me when I was trying to make sense of what was going on with Obama, and that led me to the books and the rest. So I tried to, at the beginning of the talk, I tried to talk about some of the pieces in Karen's exhibition in terms of this distinction between one function of contemporary art is to criticize the pathologies and fictions in which we exist, and another side of it is to offer other fictions, right? What I was calling associational fictions, and that was and I would have liked to develop that a bit more, but this thing got in the way. Who's next? It's down here, and then. It'd be much better if someone else decided who. Hi, Ross. I've got to, Ross. I used to live with Ross. He's got to speak. No, sorry. Who's next? Okay, then here and later there. Okay.
Hi, Simon.
Let's go this way.
Mr. Critchley.
Mr. Critchley, I like that.
Yeah, I should say, like,
Professor Critchley, please.
I think for someone in your position, it's a brave thing to take on this topic, because obviously, there's a certain quality to it which is very present, and I appreciate the kind of bravery of that gesture. So
something's coming now. I can feel it. Something.
But I have to say, I was very disappointed. I felt like I was listening to a cross between David Brooks, Maureen Dowd, and Dr. Phil. Like I felt that you basically
Jesus.
You had taken
Dr. Phil.
You basically,
I think it's just my hairstyle.
You kind of bought the party line, or the media message,
Really?
That basically there's this Obama Messiah figure, and there are these.
I didn't say that.
No, but you
did. I say Obama
you did in a way
Messiah
because
figure? I said Bush was the millenarian.
No,
the
but
messianic belief.
Okay.
So that's wrong.
You posited in a general sense this concept of people who desperately needed Obama to change things and desperately needed, hope as such,
Do you
right?
think that's wrong?
That's not what you
Do
were
you
doing?
think it's a wrong description?
So what was the last line of your essay?
It was, let me quote, a change become believing in the crushing realization that nothing will change.
Who's you? And why is, who's crushed?
No, we can believe in, we.
Right. So, I mean, I think there's a definite sort of, subtext there that people are desperate. Another point you said he's desperately craving, attention or something, or desperately craving.
Have you read The Audacity of Hope?
Yes, I have.
So
yeah.
you understand what I mean, though. I'm not putting that into his mouth. That's, if you read the book, it's all about an experience of loneliness and detachment, which he's trying to overcome. This is the dilemma that he identifies in relation to his mother. The book is dedicated to his mother, and that's the dilemma that he only resolves through his commitment to Christianity.
Okay.
Tell me where I've got that wrong.
Right. Well, from what I was hearing, the way I was listening to what you were saying, was that it was this kind of highly sort of biographical examination of somebody, for instance, taking The Audacity of Hope, which is clearly written at a time where he knows he's going to be running, or where he's an established politician, where he needs to position himself in a certain way, and to extract from that deep and meaningful analysis as to somebody's core psychological sort of construction seems to me to be taking something that's actually a rather superficial presentation of a subject and sort of extrapolating it into this kind of pop psychology. That's,
So it should be treated as a superficial work of no importance.
No, that's not what I'm saying. But
That's
I don't
what you
think.
are saying.
No, but I think
And
you're
make yourself
positing
clear.
yourself as a kind of decoder of this mystery, this opaque mystery of Obama, and I just, personally found it a little bit superficial. And I think that there were,
that's fine. If when I attain the appropriate conceptual depth, I will be back in touch with you for instruction.
I'm
Until
sure.
such time, I will continue
I
with
should
my
just
superficial
say
work.
again to go back to my understanding the conditions of what you're doing and the fact that you are actually, making a certain step. So.
It's really quite modest. I'm just trying to. There's a puzzlement, a bewilderment, and I went to the books to try and find out whether I could learn something more about that. That's it. The only thing that could be David Brooks-ish is the anti-politics stuff at the moment, which I coded in the conditional tense, if you remember. That wasn't a critique I actually made. It was a critique that you could make, should you be so disposed. And the Dr. Phil, I shall take as a compliment. Dr. Phil. Who was next? Over down here.
Thank you. I think ever since he decided to run, people have been wondering about whether Obama is uncorruptible or just hasn't been corrupted yet by politics. And I was wondering if you think his lack of experience makes him naive, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, and whether after 2 years in the White House, we won't see him as the same person, as a fresh face, politics.
I don't think the lack of experience thing is a big issue, because he doesn't lack intelligence, and the present incumbent lacks both, or lacked both, and so I'm not so worried about that. I think he'd make a perfectly good president. I think. Oh, naive? No. I think it's a. There is something wonderfully naive about I like naivety, right? there's something wonderfully naive about the narrative voice in Dreams from My Father. There's a sort of rage and anger and an attempt to work something out about who he is, which I find, in a sense, what I find less impressive about The Audacity of Hope is it's too strategic. He's pressing a certain number of buttons. No, I mean, it's the attempt. I mean, the way I see it is that the, you know, how do we infuse liberalism? I'm not a liberal, right? So I'm speaking as a spectator. How do we infuse liberalism with something like belief? Right? I mean, what happened in the last election was that the religious belief was something that they do, was given over to, as it were, to them, and liberals become overly concerned with constitutional and legal niceties. What Obama's trying to do, which is what puts me in mind of Rousseau, is to combine liberalism with some sort of civil profession of faith. And that raises questions about whether you can harness something like Christianity and belief in God in that way. That's the ambition. But I think it's a necessary naivety. I think there has to be something like belief at the core of politics. So in that sense, there has to be a naivety. Otherwise we become, we just engage in knowing distance and irony, which is what we've been doing for the last 8 years, or you've been doing. No idea.
Can we still call him naive in 4 years, and how do you think that's going to affect public perception of him?
I don't know. I really don't know. Honestly. There's a question here, friend.
Maybe it's following on too much from the last question, but how far do you think your apprehensions about Obama's opacity are fueled by the British experience of the tainting of New Labour's white political narrative?
Right, okay. Yeah, go on.
I have it written, so I can.
That's good, it's good.
How far do you think your apprehensions about Obama's opacity are fueled by the British experience of the tainting of New Labour's whiter-than-white political narrative? I just wondered if, over the 9 years of British politics, we had that same 9 years ago, I can only vaguely remember it, euphoria when New Labour came to power.
It's
parallel. The same will play out.
It's parallel with, there are similarities and differences. I mean, the difference is obviously that the Labour were in opposition for 18 years, and that 18 years was a period of intense ideological conflict and, you know, social, legislative, governmental revolution, the destruction of organised labour, foreign military expeditions and all the rest, a sort of millenarian politics, you know, Thatcher style. And then, you know, 4 election defeats, and then finally Blair's victory. I stopped being a member of the Labour Party in 1994. I stopped being an activist in 1992 because the party was drifting too far to the centre for my liking. But I was, you know, ecstatic when Blair won. I remember what that felt like. It's extraordinary. I mean, so that there is that similarity with the situation here, it's but there are differences. I mean, it's been 2 disastrous terms. I mean, the strange thing about this, with the political system here, is that, I mean, what happened in Britain, say, between Thatcher and Blair? I mean, with our system of government, you can put through programs of legislation incredibly quickly that have extraordinary consequences.
In what sense is it possible to believe something for which one believes contrary evidence, or evidence to the contrary? In other words, could one believe X while simultaneously believing not X? Now, certainly it seems to be the case that one could say that they believe X and actually privately believe not X, in which case we call such people hypocrites. In other cases, I mean, I take it that we would be tempted to say that one is irrational if they're trying to believe X and not X at the same time. So for Obama, or for those that want to believe in Obama, would you say that they're irrational or hypocrites?
Oh, well, neither. I think there are the mood that has descended since Palin's speech at the RNC is interesting, and obviously people are extremely worried, right? So there's a deep sense of not X at the moment that the Democrats are going to lose on November the 4th. There's much more slippage between not X. If X is belief in Obama, and not X is the idea this is not going to work, I think we oscillate between the two. I mean, the lessons of the last, particularly the lessons of the last two presidential campaigns, are so painful that people are understandably extremely anxious. I'm not a political analyst, as is perfectly clear from the talk, but it's, I've tried and follow this closely. It just seems that in the key areas, he has the votes, or at least it seems he has the votes to win them. So, it seems to me that he'll win the Electoral College, it seems to me. And maybe he'll lose the popular vote. But that doesn't matter. Who was next? I think Ross was next.
There are kind of two parts of your talk. One was the kind of comment from time to time that you really did want Obama to win, and you really did hope these president incumbents were thrown out and things like that. And they're the kind of remarks that you make in passing. And the rest is this account of somehow, you're trying to understand the kind of what makes Obama tick and the puzzlement about the opacity and stuff like that. Now, I guess what I missed was a link between the two. Why the kind of account that you gave might lead us to think that we should vote for Obama or hope that he wins. Or is it just a personal preference that there's no real connection between the one's a view we all share, and the other is a kind of analysis, but they don't actually gel in any way?
Yeah, I mean, you're right to detect that. I mean, there's a hypothesis that I floated at some point towards the end, that maybe the opacity is the source of his political genius, right? And I think that just struck me at a certain point as an interesting thought. I don't know whether it has any felicity or not. I don't know, but it's the thought was that it's his sense of detachment, his sense of loneliness, the opacity that's somehow there that fuses with our sense of detachment and loneliness, and it's that in which we believe. So this remark about the, I'm all things to all people. It's not me. It's you. Is interesting, right? There's a sense in which this goes back to the question of charisma. The gentleman's left, but the idea that that there is there's something opaque about that charismatic identity, which allows us to cover it with different political significations. So maybe maybe the opacity is the source of the political genius, rather than the obstruction to it. I'm not sure. And in the talk, I don't really come down one side. I'm just not clear. But at the same time, there is something. There's a question I have, at least, about the issue of. Again, I mean, going back to say the comparison with Clinton, with Bill Clinton, that the. There is I'm borrowing this from my wife, so I apologize. There is a perversity of enjoyment in Clinton, which somehow manifests itself in the speech, a sort of perversity of enjoyment. You don't see that in Obama, right? You get the sense of this extraordinary discipline and control and rigor, but the sense of a sort of an unfinished, perverse enjoyment which is somehow bubbling through, I don't get that. I even get that with W, you know? You get the idea this man, you know, who chokes on nachos while watching a ball game. There's a perverse enjoyment to that, right? So, and maybe, you know, maybe it's something like that we also latch onto in figures that we feel, you know, that we vote for. I don't know. There's another. Yeah, who wants to? There's a bunch of. Karen, you decide. You're the. Okay.
Maybe I would like to start with a quote from a lecture I heard yesterday by Greg Bordowitz, where he spoke about belief, and he also started with Hume, so it's interesting.
Okay.
And he
Must
basically said that belief is the emotion that elevates thought to truth. And I think that's a very interesting way of looking at this question of belief in a philosophical way. Having said that, I was a little startled about that you were describing Obama as with the opaqueness. I think, yeah, that's political genius, but that applies to Bush, too. George W. Bush did the same thing. It wasn't not that interesting to us because the others are, you know, like... But what I think is interesting for me, if I listen to you, is this kind of... I became aware of that the Republicans address a kind of a private desire or a private figure, or this private opaqueness where the Democrats do it, or Obama particularly deals with this public persona. And I actually think that if I would give him a political genius, it is that through that notion of belief that he's actually trying to bridge the private with the public. And I think that is really what could be interesting in, and I was hoping you could maybe go there a little bit and talk about that. It seemed like your talk was going there, but then...
Well, sure. Yeah, I mean, the idea that, I mean, this is a presidential campaign based on memoir, on autobiography, on
no, but larger, as political, like, you know, Palin is loved because everybody wants her at the barbecue, you know. We like Obama because he's a public figure who thinks about the public, you know, kind of policy and community and, you know. So I think it's a real divide in this country between political desires that are played out in this campaign more than ever, because it is not that somebody's smarter and somebody's stupid. The Republicans standing up, we're talking knowledge against knowledge, but it's like this kind of notion of the private and the notion of the public. I think that could be interesting to address, and then this how belief is kind of an activation, you know, the emotion that gets us to act.
Yeah, well, that's good. That's good. I think, you know, I suppose I see that he's trying to, you know, he's trying to stitch together the public and the private in order to overcome the problem of irony. I guess I think that it also, I find the public figure side of it problematic. You know, I think the Mile High Stadium speech was a mistake. I think the speech in Berlin was a huge mistake, a really stupid error. You don't want Europeans in love with you. That's the last thing you want. You know, Americans don't like that. And there is, and with Bush, I think I disagree. I think I know this guy. You know, there's something about Bush that, you know, that stupid perversity. You think you know that. You know. But the idea of belief is...
He didn't want Bush in his campaign. Didn't want you to vote for him. He wanted the Republican body to vote for him. So this is what I mean, like the kind of him basically being this empty screen, the empty signifier, is like a strategy that Bush used, and very successfully, to have like all these people latch onto him that really shouldn't, if they really would, you know, all the believers and so on and so on. And I think Obama does the same with his constituency, but the way opacity works is very different in these two fields. You know? And that's what's that's why it wasn't interesting for us to analyze Bush that way. But it's interesting because he gets us through it, and that's why I feel like you're responding to it. That's maybe the exercise that Irene was addressing. Like, what are we dealing with, you know, as a thought?
Okay. No, I take that. It's good. It's good. All right. Thank you.